Throughout history, the most revolutionary ideas have emerged during times of crisis, conflict, and resistance. Philosophy isn't just theory, it's a force that transforms societies, challenges authority, and reshapes the way we see the world. In this video, we're diving into the 50 most dangerous philosophers and thinkers of all time, the ones whose words have echoed across the centuries, inspiring fear, admiration, and revolution. Get ready for an intellectual journey through ideas that have changed and are still changing the course of humanity. Plato is one of the most enigmatic and influential figures in the history of philosophy. His ideas have crossed centuries, shaped Western culture, and continue to challenge us to this day. But what makes Plato dangerous? It's not just his extraordinary intelligence, but the depth with which he questioned reality itself. Imagine living in a world where everything you see, touch, and feel is just a shadow. That's the heart of his famous allegory of the cave, found in his work, The Republic. Plato shows us that most people live trapped inside a metaphorical cave, seeing only projections of reality, never truly seeing the truth behind appearances. The light of truth is painful, but also liberating. And how many times in our own lives do we choose the comfort of the shadows instead of facing the challenge of truth? This kind of thinking is dangerous because it demands responsibility. Plato forces us to abandon our comfort zones. He confronts us with a choice. Will you keep accepting the world as it is, or will you seek true wisdom, even if it hurts? Another reason Plato remains so subversive is his belief that the physical world, what we perceive with our senses, is flawed and illusory. According to him, what's truly real are the ideas, or forms, perfect, eternal concepts that exist in a higher plane of existence. A perfect circle, only in the world of forms. Perfect justice, only in the realm of ideas. This vision shattered, and still challenges, our common perception of reality. Politically, Plato was also a provocateur. In The Republic, he argued for rule by philosophers, those who seek truth above all else. For Plato, most people aren't fit to govern because they're guided by desires and passions. Only those who reach true knowledge could make just and wise decisions. A deeply elitist idea, but one that raises an unsettling question: who really deserves to hold power? Plato also inspired later philosophical movements, like Neoplatonism, and heavily influenced medieval Christian thought. St. Augustine, for example, was deeply shaped by Platonic metaphysics. The search for a supreme good, for a universal truth, these are clear echoes of Plato's philosophy. In today's increasingly relativistic world, Plato remains dangerous because he insists that there is an objective truth to be found, and maybe that's his greatest challenge to us. Are you ready to leave the cave? If Plato was the philosopher of abstract ideas and invisible worlds, Aristotle was the philosopher of concrete reality. A student of Plato, but also one of his biggest critics, Aristotle brought philosophy back down to earth. His approach was more empirical, more focused on what we can observe, analyze, and categorize. And that's exactly why Aristotle became such a dangerous figure. He taught generations to think systematically, logically, and rationally about everything that exists. In his work Metaphysics, Aristotle asks a fundamental question: what is being? From there, he develops one of the most comprehensive analyses of existence ever written. He introduces the theory of the four causes, a framework still used in many fields today: material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. In simpler terms, Aristotle taught us that nothing happens by accident and that everything has multiple, interconnected explanations. In ethics, his book Nicomachean Ethics is basically a masterclass on how to live well. Aristotle challenges us to seek virtue, to follow the famous golden mean, avoiding extremes in behavior. For him, happiness, what he called eudaimonia, isn't just a fleeting emotional state. It's a lifelong project built on virtuous actions. And that's dangerous, because it pulls us out of our comfort zones. It's not enough to just feel good. To be happy, according to Aristotle, you have to put in continuous work towards self-mastery and moral development. Beyond that, Aristotle revolutionized logic with his development of the syllogism, a form of deductive reasoning that became the foundation of formal logic for over 2,000 years. He created a method of thinking that demands clarity, coherence, and intellectual rigor. In today's age of misinformation, fake news, and twisted narratives, Aristotelian logic is a powerful weapon, and for some, that makes it dangerous. Politically, Aristotle wasn't neutral either. In his work Politics, he analyzed different forms of government and how each could become corrupted. He warned that every type of power can degenerate. Monarchy can turn into tyranny, aristocracy into oligarchy, and democracy into demagoguery. His diagnosis remains shockingly relevant today. Aristotle is dangerous because he forces us to face facts, search for causes, act ethically, and think logically. He dismantles shallow beliefs and demands a life of constant reflection. And the question he leaves us with is simple, but profound. Are you willing to live with philosophical responsibility in the face of reality? Few philosophers have caused as much discomfort and triggered as many ruptures as Friedrich Nietzsche. Calling him dangerous is no exaggeration. Nietzsche didn't come to soothe restless souls. He came to set certainties on fire. His words cut like blades, and his ideas challenge values that Western civilization has held sacred for centuries. One of Nietzsche's most explosive concepts is the idea of the death of God, first presented in The Gay Science and later expanded in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. When Nietzsche says God is dead, he's not talking about a literal death. He's describing the collapse of the moral, religious, and metaphysical foundations that once held European culture together. And if God is dead, what's left? A moral vacuum, an absence of meaning, and an urgent need for humanity to create its own values. Nietzsche challenges each of us to become the creators of our own morality. This is where the concept of the Übermensch or overman comes in. The common person is weak, conditioned, reactive. The overman, on the other hand, is someone who creates their own rules, who lives with intensity, who affirms life even in the face of suffering. Nietzsche dares us. Are you capable of living affirmatively without clinging to metaphysical illusions for comfort? His philosophy of the will to power, outlined in works like The Will to Power, is a double-edged sword. For Nietzsche, all life is an expression of strength, of expansion, of overcoming obstacles. There's no room for victimhood or resignation, and that's dangerous because it tears down narratives of passivity and forces us to confront our own responsibility to act. Nietzsche also deconstructed traditional concepts like truth, morality, and reason. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he launches a fierce critique of Judeo-Christian morality, which he calls slave morality. For him, values like humility, obedience, and sacrifice were survival strategies developed by the weak to cope with the strong. A perspective that, even today, sparks heated debates and discomfort. His writing style is poetic, aphoristic, and often cryptic. Nietzsche doesn't give easy answers. In fact, he throws out questions like existential dynamite. He doesn't want obedient followers. He wants courageous thinkers, people willing to question everything, even Nietzsche himself. The biggest lesson Nietzsche leaves us is simple and brutal. Life is hard. Suffering is inevitable, but it's up to us to create meaning. And he asks, are you going to keep chasing comfortable truths, or will you have the courage to stare into the abyss? At first glance, Immanuel Kant might seem harmless. A quiet, methodical man who spent almost his entire life in Königsberg, following the same daily routine. But behind this image of serenity was a mind that completely revolutionized philosophy and became a direct threat to the dogmas and certainties of his time. Kant is dangerous because he changed how we understand knowledge, morality, and even the very structure of reality itself. His most famous work, Critique of Pure Reason, was a turning point in the history of thought. Kant made us realize that the world we perceive isn't the world in itself, it's the world as it appears to us. In other words, reality, as we experience it, is shaped by the structures of our own minds. That means time, space, and causality aren't properties of the external world, but mental frameworks we use to organize our experiences. This idea shakes the very foundation of our trust in direct, objective reality. Kant asks, how much of what you call real is actually just a product of your own mind? But Kant didn't stop there. His moral revolution is also one of the most powerful in the history of philosophy. In Critique of Practical Reason and Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, he developed the concept of the categorical imperative, a simple yet demanding rule. Act only according to a principle that you would want to become a universal law. This forces us into deep ethical reflection. Before making any decision, we have to ask ourselves, what if everyone did the same thing I'm about to do? Kant's ethics doesn't rely on consequences, feelings, or personal desires. It's a morality rooted in reason and the inherent dignity of every human being. Kant demands total responsibility for our actions. In a world where values are often seen as relative or flexible, Kantian ethics feels like a rock in your shoe. It demands integrity, consistency, and unconditional respect for others. Kant reminds us that no person should ever be treated merely as a means to an end, but always as an end in themselves. Beyond that, his political philosophy, especially in texts like Perpetual Peace, anticipated many modern concepts like human rights and international cooperation. Kant is dangerous because he strips away our easy excuses. He reminds us that being moral isn't about feelings or convenience, it's about rational duty. And the big question Kant leaves us with is this: are you willing to live by universal principles, even when it's not the easiest path? Few names carry as much historical weight as Karl Marx. He wasn't just a philosopher, he was a force of transformation. His ideas crossed borders, inspired revolutions, and reshaped the political and economic landscape of the modern world. And that's exactly why Marx is considered dangerous. His theories didn't stay in the realm of abstract ideas. They were put into action. In his most famous work, Das Kapital, Marx delivers a relentless critique of the capitalist system. He introduces us to the concept of surplus value. The worker creates much more value than they receive in wages, and this difference is taken by the capitalist as profit. Marx challenges us to look beyond the apparent normalcy of work relationships. How many of us have accepted long hours, low wages, and social inequality as just the way life is? Another central and highly provocative idea is class struggle. For Marx, human history is the history of conflict between oppressors and the oppressed, slaves and masters, serfs and nobles, proletariat and bourgeoisie. This makes Marx a radical critic of the established order. He didn't just describe the world, he called for its transformation. In his famous theses on Feuerbach, he writes, "Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Marx's view also shakes the idea of ideological neutrality. For him, even our ideas, culture, and morality are shaped by material conditions and power structures. What we call truth is often just the world view of those who control the means of production. That's deeply uncomfortable, because it forces us to question the very roots of our own beliefs. Politically, Marx dreamed of overcoming capitalism and building a classless society, where the means of production would be collectively owned, and work would become a free and creative activity. An ideal that, throughout the 20th century, was interpreted in many different and often controversial ways, leading to both liberation movements and authoritarian regimes. Marx's thought remains dangerous because it pushes us to look at the invisible structures shaping our lives. It provokes us to ask, who really benefits from the way we live and work? Is there any real possibility for a more just society? As controversial and divisive as his ideas are, Marx remains an intellectual force that's impossible to ignore. And the question he leaves us with is direct. Are you willing to confront the contradictions of the system you live in? René Descartes, often called the father of modern philosophy, is one of those thinkers whose influence runs so deep that most of the time, we don't even realize how much we're still trapped in his way of thinking. And that's exactly why Descartes is dangerous. He taught generations to doubt everything, including their own certainties. His most famous work, Meditations on First Philosophy, is a true invitation to radical skepticism. Descartes suggests we should suspend all our beliefs and question everything we think we know. He starts with what's called methodical doubt, an extreme exercise in intellectual distrust. Can our senses deceive us? Does the external world even exist? Could even mathematical truths be illusions planted by some evil genius? It's in this context that Descartes delivers his most famous and revolutionary statement, Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. A phrase that seems simple, but marked a turning point in philosophy. Descartes finds in doubt itself the one unshakable certainty. If I'm doubting, then I'm thinking. And if I'm thinking, then I exist. This became the starting point for the entire foundation of modern knowledge. But Descartes' danger doesn't stop there. By placing reason as the supreme measure of truth, he launched a new era of rationalism, one that shaped not only philosophy, but also science, mathematics, and even psychology. Descartes taught us to look for clear, distinct, and logically rigorous explanations. He wanted a safe and reliable method for reaching truth, and with that, he laid the groundwork for modern scientific thinking. In his work, Discourse on Method, Descartes suggests that to find truth, we should break big problems into smaller parts, analyze each one carefully, and only then put the whole picture back together. This method is still used today across countless fields of knowledge. However, by separating mind and body, creating the famous Cartesian dualism, Descartes opened up a philosophical dilemma that continues to this day. How can an immaterial mind interact with a material body? This separation, while productive in many areas, also created a divide between reason and emotion, between subject and world, sparking debates that still shape philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. Descartes is dangerous because he taught us to doubt even the most obvious things. He forces us not to accept easy answers, to seek solid foundations for our beliefs, and to view the world with critical eyes. And the big question he leaves us is this: do you have the courage to question everything you've always believed to be true? Jean-Jacques Rousseau was one of the most restless and controversial thinkers of the Enlightenment. His philosophy is both deeply inspiring and dangerously subversive. Rousseau didn't just challenge the political and social structures of his time, he also raised questions that still echo today, forcing us to rethink the nature of freedom, morality, and civilization itself. In his work, The Social Contract, Rousseau introduced a revolutionary idea. True political legitimacy only exists when a government reflects the general will of the people. For him, sovereignty lies with the people, and any authority that doesn't come from this collective will is illegitimate. In a world still ruled by absolute monarchies, this was an explosive idea. His famous line, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," is a cry against oppression and inequality. But Rousseau wasn't just a political theorist. His reflections on human nature are equally provocative. In Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men, he argues that humans in their natural state are good, peaceful, and free. It's society, with its corrupt institutions and power games, that turns people into selfish, competitive beings. This forces us to ask, to what extent are our so-called natural behaviors actually shaped by social structures that condition us? Rousseau pushes us to look critically at social conventions, at the norms we follow automatically, without ever questioning. His critique of private property is also one of his most famous and most dangerous ideas. Rousseau points out that the root of inequality started the moment someone fenced off a piece of land and said, "This is mine," and even worse, when others accepted that as truth. This line of thinking has inspired many social and revolutionary movements throughout history. In education, Rousseau didn't hold back on controversy either. In his work, Emile, or On Education, he proposed a model of learning based on freedom and the natural development of the child, challenging the authoritarian and repressive methods of his time. Rousseau is dangerous because he refuses to accept reality as it is. He invites us to imagine a different world, one that's more just, more equal. But he also warns us, true freedom requires responsibility and active participation. And the big question Rousseau leaves us with is this: are you ready to question the rules of the society you live in and take the risk of building something new? Thomas Hobbes is one of the most feared and at the same time most misunderstood political philosophers in history. His view of human nature and social organization is so raw, so blunt, that even today it triggers shock and rejection. And that's exactly why Hobbes is dangerous. He forces us to face the darker side of human nature. In his most famous work, Leviathan, Hobbes describes the natural state of humanity as a war of all against all. Without laws, without government, without a central authority, humans, driven by fear, desire, and the instinct to survive, would inevitably fall into conflict. His most quoted and probably most provocative line is, "Man is a wolf to man, homo homini lupus." Hobbes paints this natural state as a scenario where life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This deeply pessimistic view of human nature makes us ask, are we really as civilized as we think? Or is it just the presence of laws and institutions that keeps us from collapsing into chaos? Hobbes's solution to avoid this constant war is the creation of an absolute sovereign power, the Leviathan, a metaphor for a strong state with centralized authority. According to Hobbes, in order to live in a functioning society, individuals must give up part of their freedom and submit to this higher power in exchange for safety and social peace. This is dangerous thinking because it justifies the concentration of power as a legitimate way to maintain order. Hobbes has no democratic illusions or romantic ideals about human nature. For him, unchecked freedom leads to chaos, and obedience to the state is the price of civilization. But Hobbes also leaves us with a warning that still feels relevant today. When the state weakens, the risk of social collapse rises. His ideas help explain why, in times of crisis, so many societies turn to authoritarian leaders. There's a collective fear of falling back into the natural state of chaos. At the same time, Hobbes makes us think about the limits of power. How much freedom are we willing to give up for the sake of security? In an age of digital surveillance, information control, and political repression, the Hobbesian debate feels more urgent than ever. The big question Hobbes leaves us with is unsettling. Would you rather have freedom without security, or security that limits your freedom? Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel is without a doubt one of the most complex and influential philosophers in history. His thinking is like an intellectual labyrinth, full of abstract and difficult concepts, but also incredibly powerful. And that's exactly why Hegel is dangerous. His ideas shaped not just philosophy, but also politics, history, and even the ideologies behind some of the most impactful regimes of the 20th century. One of Hegel's most famous contributions is the concept of dialectics, especially the well-known triad, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Even though Hegel himself never laid it out exactly in these terms, this idea became popularized as a way to understand the movement of history and reality, a continuous process of conflict and resolution. Every idea contains within it the seeds of its own negation, and through that conflict, a new, more advanced stage of understanding emerges. In his work Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel presents a bold vision. Human history is the story of the self-consciousness of spirit. By spirit, he doesn't mean something mystical, but rather a rational force that develops and evolves through historical events, learning from mistakes and growing through the clash of opposites. This historical view is dangerous because it turns conflict into a necessary engine of progress. Hegel legitimizes the idea that major ruptures, wars, and revolutions can be seen as inevitable steps in the development of reason in the world. This logic went on to heavily influence later thinkers, including Karl Marx, who adapted Hegelian dialectics into the theory of class struggle. Another central idea from Hegel is that freedom can only be fully realized within an ethical state. For him, individual freedom isn't some isolated personal liberty. It's something that exists within political and legal institutions that protect the common good. That belief in the state as the rational expression of collective freedom is inspiring in some ways, but also deeply authoritarian in others. After all, how far can the state go in deciding what's best for everyone? Hegel also viewed history through almost a prophetic lens. In his philosophy of history, he argued that history has a rational purpose. We're not just wandering aimlessly. There's a logic behind events, even if we can't always understand it in the moment. And this is where the real danger of Hegel lies. His philosophy has been used to justify both freedom and authoritarianism. It has inspired movements of emancipation, but also propped up centralized regimes. And the big question Hegel leaves us with is, can you recognize the rationality behind the conflicts and contradictions of history? St. Augustine is one of the most fascinating and complex figures in the history of philosophy and Christian theology. His ideas have lasted for centuries, influencing not only medieval philosophy, but also ethics, psychology, and the Western concept of good and evil. And what makes him dangerous? His ability to unite reason and faith so deeply that even the most skeptical minds are forced to engage with his ideas. Before becoming one of Christianity's greatest thinkers, Augustine lived a youth full of existential searching, as he openly shares in his most famous work, Confessions. In this book, he tells the story of his spiritual restlessness, his mistakes, vices, and doubts, all leading up to his conversion to Christianity. This personal and introspective tone makes Augustine an extremely human and relatable philosopher, even when dealing with deep and complex issues. One of Augustine's most dangerous ideas is his concept of will and free will. At a time when many believed that evil was some external force or independent entity, Augustine offered a radical answer. Evil doesn't exist on its own. It's a corruption of the good, a result of human bad choices. In other words, the problem of evil is inside us, in our decisions. This forces us to confront moral responsibility in a direct and often uncomfortable way. Another key point in his thinking is his theory of time, developed in Confessions. For Augustine, past, present, and future are psychological realities that exist only in the human mind. Time, according to him, is a perception of the soul. This reflection anticipated many modern philosophical debates about the nature of consciousness and time. In his work, The City of God, Augustine presents a political and theological vision of history. He divides the world into the city of God and the city of man. The first represents the community of believers guided by love for God. The second represents earthly society, driven by self-love and the desire for power. This distinction brought a whole new way of thinking about the relationship between political power and spiritual values, a discussion that deeply shaped Western political philosophy. St. Augustine is dangerous because he forces us to look inward. He makes us confront our guilt, our motivations, and our choices. His philosophy is a constant call for introspection and moral transformation. And the question Augustine leaves us with is direct and still incredibly relevant today. Are you willing to take responsibility for your own actions and strive for a life guided by a higher good? Søren Kierkegaard, often called the father of existentialism, is one of the most unsettling and provocative philosophers in history. His ideas don't offer easy comfort, ready-made systems, or universal truths packaged for mass consumption. And that's exactly why Kierkegaard is dangerous. He forces us to stare into the emptiness of existence and face the anxiety that comes with true freedom of choice. In works like The Sickness Unto Death and The Concept of Anxiety, Kierkegaard dives deep into the rawest parts of human experience. For him, despair isn't an exception, it's a universal condition. At some point in life, everyone faces the weight of their choices and the realization that existence offers no guarantees. Freedom, which should in theory liberate us, actually throws us into a constant state of uncertainty and responsibility. Kierkegaard also shakes us with his concept of the leap of faith. In his book, Fear and Trembling, he analyzes the biblical story of Abraham, who was asked to sacrifice his own son as an act of faith. For Kierkegaard, this is the ultimate example of what it means to live authentically, making decisions that defy logic, that go against universal ethics, but that are done with deep personal conviction. Faith, in this sense, is an irrational but absolutely necessary choice. This line of thinking is dangerous because it breaks the idea that reason alone can guide us. Kierkegaard reminds us that living is an act of risk and courage, and that many of life's most important decisions are made without certainty. He asks, "Are you ready to choose, even knowing you might be wrong?" Another key point in his philosophy is the idea of authentic existence. For Kierkegaard, living authentically means taking full responsibility for your own life, not hiding behind social conventions or imposed roles. And that's deeply uncomfortable, because it forces us to leave behind the apathy and superficiality that often define modern life. Kierkegaard was also a sharp critic of organized religion. For him, true faith isn't about mechanical rituals or blind obedience. It's about a personal, intense, and often anxiety-filled relationship with the divine. At the core, Kierkegaard is dangerous because he strips away all our existential crutches. He leaves us standing in front of the mirror with one unavoidable question echoing back. Do you have the courage to truly be yourself, with all the consequences that come with that choice? Jean-Paul Sartre never needed soft metaphors to say what he meant. His philosophy is a direct punch to all the comforting beliefs we use to shield ourselves from existential emptiness. Instead of offering reassuring answers, Sartre throws an uncomfortable truth right at us. There is no predefined purpose to human existence. We're thrown into the world, and the responsibility of giving life meaning is entirely ours. In his book, Being and Nothingness, Sartre digs deep into the idea that existence precedes essence. This means we're born without any inherent purpose or fixed nature. Throughout life, it's through our choices that we build who we really are. Sartre challenges us with a critical question. Are you living according to conscious choices, or just going with the flow on autopilot? This total freedom, which might sound liberating at first, is also a huge source of anxiety. Sartre calls it the condemnation to be free. We're condemned to choose. Even doing nothing is still a choice. There's no escaping responsibility for our actions. Every decision, no matter how small, becomes a brick in the construction of our identity. In his essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre responds to critics who accused existentialism of being pessimistic. For him, recognizing that we're free and responsible is actually the highest form of valuing human existence. There's no instruction manual for life. Each of us has to create our own path, with courage and authenticity. Politically, Sartre was an engaged thinker. He saw philosophy as a tool for social transformation. He took controversial stances, supported revolutionary movements, and was a fierce critic of colonialism and bourgeois hypocrisy. That made him even more dangerous in the eyes of those who preferred to maintain the status quo. Another thing that makes Sartre so uncomfortable for many readers is his brutal critique of self-deception, what he calls bad faith. This is the attitude of lying to ourselves to avoid responsibility. Whether it's at work, in relationships, or in our daily decisions, Sartre warns, it's easier to blame others, fate, or circumstances, but that's just cowardice. His philosophy isn't just an invitation, it's a challenge to embrace radical authenticity. No excuses, no ready-made scripts. There's only you, your freedom, and the inevitable consequences of every act. And now, Sartre leaves us with a question that still echoes. Do you have the courage to be the author of your own story, or will you keep hiding? When most people think of Charles Darwin, they picture the naturalist who traveled the world aboard the HMS Beagle and wrote On the Origin of Species. But reducing Darwin to just a scientist misses the explosive philosophical impact his ideas had on how we understand life, morality, and even our place in the universe. And that's exactly why Darwin is dangerous. He shook the foundations of beliefs humanity had clung to for thousands of years. Darwin's theory of natural selection, presented in 1859, delivered a disturbing message. Living beings, including us humans, are not the result of some intelligent design, divine plan, or pre-established essence. We are the product of a long, messy process of mutations, adaptations, and the selection of traits that helped us survive. This alone was already a cultural shock for Victorian society, which was still deeply rooted in traditional Christian views of creation. The idea that humanity shares common ancestors with other animal species instantly shattered the long-held pride of being a special, separate creation in the universe. But Darwin's philosophical danger goes far beyond biology. His theory opened the door to ethical, social, and existential debates that still make people uncomfortable today. If evolution is driven by natural selection and survival of the fittest, what does that say about our ideas of morality, solidarity, and justice? Does life have any intrinsic purpose, or is everything just the result of blind, random processes? Philosophers like Nietzsche, Freud, and later existentialists all felt the aftershocks of Darwinian thought. The realization that humans are not the center of creation hit humanity's collective ego hard. Darwin forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We're just another species on the vast stage of life. Throughout the 20th century, Darwin's ideas were also twisted and misused by pseudoscientific theories like social Darwinism, which tried to justify social inequality and even racist practices under the false banner of natural selection. This only added more controversy to his legacy. Darwin is dangerous because he pulls us out of the comfort zone of predetermined purpose and meaning. He makes us face life as it really is, complex, unpredictable, and often indifferent to our moral aspirations. And the big question he leaves us with is this: are you ready to accept that existence might not have a pre-written meaning, and that it's up to us to build our own sense of purpose within this evolutionary process? Voltaire was, above all, a free spirit. A writer, philosopher, playwright, and relentless critic of hypocrisy, his greatest weapon was always his words. And that's exactly why Voltaire is considered dangerous. He challenged religious dogma, questioned political abuses, and mocked the moral certainties of his time with sharp, relentless irony. His most famous work, Candide, is a direct attack on the philosophy of blind optimism. In it, Voltaire ridicules the idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds, a belief championed by philosophers like Leibniz. Through a satirical narrative, he exposes the misery, injustice, war, and religious intolerance of his era, showing that accepting suffering as something inevitable is a form of intellectual cowardice. Voltaire pushes us. Will you keep accepting the world's tragedies with a cynical smile, or will you question and act? His fight against religious fanaticism was also one of his trademarks. At a time when the Catholic Church had enormous influence over the state, Voltaire became a fierce critic of intolerance and persecution. One of his most famous quotes sums up his spirit. "I may not agree with a single word you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." That defense of free speech remains to this day a powerful symbol in the fight against censorship. In his philosophical letters, Voltaire praised the English model of religious tolerance and civil liberties, contrasting it with French absolutism. He championed reason, science, and progress as the paths to a more just and enlightened world. This stance made him a target of censorship, persecution, and even exile. Voltaire also understood that power corrupts and that governments must be constantly questioned. He didn't believe in revolutionary utopias, but in practical reforms that could genuinely improve people's lives. His pragmatism and deep distrust of any form of absolute authority made him a dangerous voice for kings, priests, and tyrants. On top of that, his biting humor disarmed enemies with intelligence. Voltaire knew that well-aimed laughter can often hit harder than the most logical argument. He's dangerous because he teaches us not to accept imposed truths. His philosophy is a call for intellectual vigilance, constant questioning, and uncompromising defense of freedom. And the question Voltaire leaves us with is simple but powerful. Are you willing to raise your voice against injustice, even if it means going against those in power? Arthur Schopenhauer is, without a doubt, one of the darkest, and at the same time, most fascinating philosophers in the history of Western thought. His radical pessimism, combined with clear and direct writing, makes him a dangerous figure for anyone who prefers to live comforted by cheap optimism. Schopenhauer forces us to face the pain of existence without filters and without emotional anesthesia. In his main work, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer presents a brutal view of reality. Everything that exists is driven by a blind, irrational, and relentless force he calls will. This will is present in everything. In plants growing toward the light, in animals searching for food, and in humans endlessly chasing desires. For Schopenhauer, life is suffering because to desire is to suffer. As soon as we achieve one goal, a new desire emerges, creating an endless cycle of dissatisfaction. There's no rest, no lasting happiness. This raw existential view shatters any illusion that we can reach true happiness through material or emotional achievements. But Schopenhauer's danger doesn't lie only in his grim diagnosis of life. His philosophy also attacks belief in human progress, the value of individual willpower, and the promises of redemption offered by religions and ideologies. He asks, is your pursuit of success, pleasure, or recognition just another chapter in this endless cycle of frustration? Despite the pessimism, Schopenhauer does offer some paths out. One of them is the denial of the will, inspired by Eastern traditions like Buddhism. He suggests that overcoming suffering involves letting go of selfish desires and embracing detachment and aesthetic contemplation. Art, especially music, holds a special place in his philosophy. When we lose ourselves in the beauty of a symphony, for example, we can, for a few moments, silence that blind will that torments us. Schopenhauer also advocates for an ethics of compassion. By recognizing universal suffering, we're led to act with empathy and solidarity, not out of moral obligation, but because we identify with the pain of others. He's dangerous because he tears apart easy self-help narratives and forces each of us to confront the tragic side of existence with brutal clarity. Schopenhauer doesn't comfort us. He wakes us up. And the question he leaves us with is direct and unsettling. Do you have the courage to see life as it really is, without masks, without illusions, and without false promises of eternal happiness? Michel Foucault is one of those philosophers who seemed born to make people uncomfortable. His ideas cut like a sharp blade, dissecting the invisible structures that govern our lives. The danger of Foucault isn't just in what he writes, but in how he forces us to question things we usually see as natural, fair, or inevitable. Foucault wasn't interested in building neat, closed philosophical systems. His goal was to dismantle them. In works like Discipline and Punish and The History of Sexuality, he shows us that power isn't just something exercised from the top down, by kings, presidents, or authorities. Power is everywhere. It exists in small practices, in language, in institutions. It's in schools, hospitals, the military, even families. It works subtly, shaping behavior, controlling bodies, and forming our very sense of identity. One of his most provocative ideas is panopticism, inspired by Jeremy Bentham's architectural design for a prison where all inmates could be watched by a single guard at any moment, without ever knowing if they're actually being watched. For Foucault, modern society has become one giant panopticon. We're constantly monitored, controlled, and disciplined, often without even realizing it. The danger here is obvious. How free can we really be if we're always under someone's gaze? In The Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault introduces another powerful concept: discourse analysis. He helps us see that what we call truth is always a product of power relationships. Knowledge isn't neutral. Those in power decide what's considered true, legitimate, or normal. His critiques of psychiatry, medicine, sexuality, and the criminal justice system reveal how science, morality, and even definitions of health and madness have been historically used to control individuals. Foucault forces us to ask, are our ideas of right and wrong, normal and abnormal, really the product of reason? Or are they just social constructs designed to maintain control? On top of that, his rejection of the idea of a universal subject shook the foundations of traditional humanism. For Foucault, the individual isn't some fixed, timeless essence, but the result of historical, social, and discursive forces shaping them from all sides. Foucault is dangerous because he puts our deepest certainties under a microscope. He doesn't just invite us, but almost forces us to see the invisible chains that bind us. And the big question he leaves us with is, are you willing to stare power in the face, recognize how it's shaped you, and question the truths you've always accepted as natural? Baruch Spinoza is one of those philosophers who, quietly but powerfully, challenged the foundations of religion, morality, and the entire Western worldview. Born into a Jewish community in Amsterdam in the 17th century, Spinoza was excommunicated at a young age, accused of heresy. And why? Because his ideas were simply too dangerous for the religious and political powers of his time. In his major work, Ethics, written in a strict, almost mathematical style, Spinoza introduced a completely revolutionary idea. God and nature are one and the same. There is no personal God, external to the world, who intervenes in human affairs. For Spinoza, God is reality itself, the sum of everything that exists. This view, known as pantheism, broke with centuries of theological tradition that separated the creator from the creation. This idea is dangerous because by erasing the separation between God and the world, Spinoza also challenges traditional views on morality, sin, and free will. In his view, everything that happens is the result of a necessary chain of causes and effects. Free will, as most people understand it, is an illusion. We are parts of a determined universe, and our actions are just expressions of this natural necessity. But if there's no free will and everything is determined, what's left for us as humans? For Spinoza, the answer lies in knowledge and understanding. True freedom isn't about doing whatever we want impulsively, but about understanding the causes that shape us and acting according to reason. That's the path to what he calls beatitude, a state of inner peace, free from destructive passions. Spinoza is also dangerous because of his take on morality. He rejects any morality based on divine rewards or eternal punishments. For him, good and evil aren't absolute categories. They're about whether something increases or decreases our power to act and exist. What's good? Anything that strengthens us and expands our ability to live and think. What's bad? Anything that weakens us or limits our capacity. His political views were also far ahead of his time. In works like the Theological Political Treatise, Spinoza defends freedom of thought as essential for a just society. This idea was so radical back then that his book was immediately banned in several countries. Spinoza is dangerous because he dismantles the foundations of a theistic and moralistic worldview. He invites us to abandon fear, ignorance, and blind conformity, and to live a life guided by reason and the pursuit of understanding. And the deep, challenging question he leaves us with is this: are you ready to live without illusions and to accept reality as it is, with all its consequences? Albert Camus is the kind of philosopher who doesn't offer easy answers, but teaches us how to face the absurdity of existence head-on. His philosophy is dangerous because it exposes a truth that many people prefer to ignore. Life, in itself, has no built-in meaning. And yet, despite this realization, Camus invites us to respond with resistance, dignity, and a fierce affirmation of life. In his most famous work, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus gives us the metaphor that sums up his worldview. The image of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to endlessly push a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down again. For Camus, this is the human condition. We struggle, suffer, and achieve, only to start all over again. Life is a repetitive cycle, without any final purpose handed down by a god or by destiny. But here's the crucial and dangerous point. Camus doesn't conclude that we should give in to despair. Quite the opposite. He says that recognizing the absurd is the first step toward freedom. Once we accept that the universe is indifferent to our desires, we're free to choose how we live. The point isn't to find meaning in life, Camus says, but to live with intensity, with defiance, and with passion in the face of the absurd. Camus also tackles the idea of philosophical suicide. For him, accepting metaphysical comforts or clinging to dogmatic beliefs just to escape the absurd is a form of intellectual cowardice. Instead, he challenges us to live with clarity and honesty, even if that means living without any guarantee of ultimate meaning. His philosophy spills over into ethics and politics too. In The Rebel, Camus explores rebellion as a fundamental human act, not a destructive rebellion, but a refusal to accept injustice, meaningless violence, and suffering imposed by power. For Camus, revolt is a way to assert human dignity, even in a world that offers no moral guarantees. What makes Camus dangerous is his refusal to give us comfortable solutions. He forces us to choose to live authentically and responsibly, even knowing there's no higher purpose guiding our actions. And because his writing is clear, direct, and easy to understand, his ideas become even more dangerous. He doesn't hide from the pain of existence, but he also doesn't let us retreat. The big question Camus leaves us with is as simple as it is devastating. Now that you know life is absurd, what are you going to do about it? Antonio Gramsci is one of those philosophers whose influence goes far beyond theory and directly into the political and cultural arena. Considered one of the most important Marxist thinkers of the 20th century, Gramsci is dangerous because he taught that power isn't maintained just through brute force or state repression. His concept of cultural hegemony forever changed the way we understand social control. While many Marxist theorists focused on economics and class struggle in purely material terms, Gramsci pointed to something more subtle and even more effective: the control of ideas, values, and beliefs. In his famous prison notebooks, written while imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist regime, Gramsci showed that the real battlefield is culture, education, media, and institutions. For Gramsci, ruling classes maintain power by gaining the consent of everyday people. That means many of us accept social structures as natural or inevitable, when in reality, they're the result of specific interests being protected. He pushes us to ask, how many of our opinions are truly our own, and how many were shaped by a culture designed to preserve the status quo? His concept of the organic intellectual is also one of his most provocative and dangerous contributions. Gramsci broke away from the idea that intellectuals are distant, academic figures disconnected from real life. For him, anyone can be an intellectual, as long as they're engaged in understanding and transforming the social conditions they live in. This idea turns every citizen into a potential agent of change. Another unsettling aspect of Gramsci's thinking is his analysis of education. He saw schools as one of the main tools of cultural hegemony. It's not just about teaching content, it's about shaping ways of thinking, about creating a worldview aligned with the interests of those in power. This critique remains incredibly relevant today, especially in debates about the role of education in shaping society. Gramsci is dangerous because he forces us to see that the fight for social justice doesn't happen only in factories or in the streets, but also in classrooms, books, TV shows, and social media feeds. Cultural power shapes how we see the world, what we consider right or wrong, possible or impossible. And the big question Gramsci leaves us with is direct and challenging. Are you just a spectator of the culture you consume, or are you ready to become an active, conscious agent of social change? Giordano Bruno is one of those figures who seemed born out of his time, a philosopher, astronomer, and mystic from the 16th century, he challenged not only the science of his day, but also the theological and moral structures that held up Renaissance Europe. And that's exactly why Bruno is considered dangerous. His ideas questioned the limits of the universe, faith, and humanity's role in the cosmos. Bruno was one of the first to boldly and passionately defend the idea that the universe is infinite and that there are countless other worlds with life beyond Earth. In works like On the Infinite Universe and Worlds, he broke away from the Aristotelian and geocentric worldview that still dominated European thought. For Bruno, the universe had no center. There was no special place reserved for Earth, let alone for humanity. This wasn't just a scientific statement, it was a metaphysical challenge to the Christian tradition, which saw humans as the center of divine creation. But Bruno didn't stop at cosmology. His real danger lay in his boldness to question the power structures and ideological control of the Church. He didn't just defend freedom of thought, he lived it in the most radical way possible. He refused to recant his beliefs in front of the Inquisition, and, because of that, he was sentenced and burned alive in 1600 in Rome. Bruno's philosophy was deeply spiritual, but not in any conventional sense. He didn't see God as a being separate from the world, but as the very substance of the universe itself. Everything exists within everything else, and God is the infinite creative energy that flows through all things. This pantheistic view was labeled heretical. By dissolving the separation between God and the world, Bruno erased the distance between the sacred and the profane, between heaven and earth. Beyond that, Bruno was a fierce critic of dogmatism and intellectual conformity. For him, a true philosopher was someone who pursued truth, even if that meant facing persecution and death. His life became a symbol of resistance against religious intolerance and the oppression of free thought. The danger of Giordano Bruno still feels relevant today. He invites us to push the boundaries of our thinking, to question what we've been taught as absolute truth, and to defend freedom of thought above any authority. And the question he leaves us with is both clear and courageous. Are you willing to stand for the truth, even if it costs you everything? Theodor Adorno was a thinker who refused to offer comfort. His philosophy is a constant critique of the contradictions, violence, and illusions that hold up modern society, and that's exactly why Adorno is dangerous. He forces us to see the hidden gears behind mass culture, consumerism, and even the very idea of progress. As a member of the Frankfurt School, Adorno, along with other thinkers, developed a deep critique of what he called the culture industry. In his book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, co-written with Max Horkheimer, he showed how culture, something that should be a space for freedom and reflection, has become a tool for domination. Movies, music, TV shows, everything becomes standardized, with one main goal: to keep people passive, compliant, and distracted. Adorno is dangerous because he dismantles the myth of cultural neutrality. For him, even the most innocent-looking entertainment can serve to reinforce an unfair social order. He pushes us to ask, is what I consume every day actually setting me free, or just putting me to sleep? Another central theme in his work is his critique of instrumental reason. According to Adorno, modern reason, rather than making us freer, has become an instrument of control and domination. This cold, calculated rationality, focused only on efficiency and profit, has produced advanced technologies, but also concentration camps. Adorno lived in exile during the Nazi regime and witnessed firsthand how barbarism could emerge from the heart of Western civilization. In his book Minima Moralia, Adorno takes on a more personal, fragmented tone, reflecting on the near impossibility of living an ethical life in a world corrupted by market logic and alienation. He warns us that even our smallest everyday gestures carry the marks of this sick society. But Adorno wasn't a nihilist. His philosophy holds a subtle hope, the belief that critical awareness can still open spaces for resistance. For him, art, especially classical music and literature, can be a refuge for authenticity and reflection, a place where independent thought can still escape the grip of the culture industry. That's Adorno's danger. He pulls us out of the comfort of ignorance and forces us to face the darker side of modern life. And the urgent question he leaves us with is, are you willing to break free from passivity and start seeing the world with truly critical eyes? Slavoj Žižek is one of the most provocative and unpredictable figures in contemporary philosophy. This Slovenian intellectual mixes psychoanalysis, Marxism, pop cinema, mass culture, and political theory into an explosive cocktail that completely disarms the unsuspecting listener. And that's exactly why Žižek is dangerous. He makes us laugh while tearing apart some of the most comfortable certainties of modern society with razor-sharp arguments. In books like Violence and Welcome to the Desert of the Real, Žižek launches a relentless critique against global capitalism, the hypocrisy of liberal politics, and the cynicism of today's social relationships. For him, we live in a society that pretends to offer freedom, but, in reality, controls our choices through consumerism, media, and ideologies disguised as common sense. One of Žižek's central ideas is invisible ideology. Inspired by Marx and Lacan, he argues that the most powerful ideology isn't the one that forces us to obey. It's the one that makes us believe we're free when we're actually deeply conditioned. How many times have you felt like you were making an authentic choice, when in reality, you were just following a socially accepted script? Žižek loves using pop culture examples, from Disney movies to Hollywood blockbusters, to show how even entertainment carries hidden political and ideological messages. He pushes us to examine our daily lives with a critical eye. What's really behind the messages we consume every day? Another reason Žižek is dangerous is his ability to laugh at his own contradictions. He presents himself as a philosopher unafraid of seeming inconsistent, because he knows reality is chaotic, contradictory, and often absurd. That honesty disarms the audience and creates the perfect space for critical thinking. On top of that, Žižek doesn't hold back even when criticizing the political left. In many of his works, he points out how certain progressive movements have fallen into the trap of empty moralism, more concerned with political correctness than with real structural change. He challenges us to move beyond easy slogans and face the real conflicts within the system. That's Žižek's danger. He forces us to laugh at ourselves, to question even our own critical awareness, and to dive headfirst into the contradictions of ideology. And the provocative question he leaves us with is this: do you really understand the forces that shape your way of thinking, or are you just pretending to be free? Jacques Derrida, the creator of deconstruction, is a direct threat to the fixed structures of Western thought. Derrida is dangerous because he doesn't give us answers. He questions the very foundations we use to build meaning, truth, and identity. Throughout his work, especially in books like Of Grammatology and Writing and Difference, Derrida challenges the traditional idea that there's a final, stable, universal meaning behind words. For him, language is never neutral. Words are always in play, always open to new interpretations, carrying multiple meanings that never settle into one definitive truth. And that's what makes Derrida's thinking so unsettling. He forces us to accept that nothing is as solid as it seems. What we call truth, justice, or even identity is always subject to shifts, ruptures, and reinterpretations. Derrida asks us, uncomfortably, are the certainties you hold on to just temporary effects of an unstable language system? One of his most famous concepts is difference, a French wordplay that combines both difference and deferral of meaning. In simple terms, the meaning of any text, speech, or idea is always postponed, never fully reachable. This is dangerous because it dismantles the comforting illusion that we can access absolute, final truths. In practice, Derrida teaches us to critically examine everything we've been told is natural, essential, or unchangeable. The categories we use to organize the world, like male and female, center and margin, reason and emotion, are historical constructions that can and should be questioned. Beyond philosophy, deconstruction has deeply influenced fields like literature, law, politics, and even architecture. Derrida's method has been used to analyze texts, speeches, and institutions, exposing internal contradictions and hidden power structures beneath the appearance of neutrality. The danger of Derrida lies exactly here. He refuses to give us solid ground. He doesn't replace one truth with another. He leaves us standing in the middle of an interpretive abyss, forcing us to think more carefully, more authentically, and less dogmatically. And the unsettling question Derrida leaves us with is this: are you ready to live in a world where truth is always temporary, open, and vulnerable to deconstruction? Herbert Marcuse was one of those philosophers who didn't just analyze the world, he provoked it. A key member of the Frankfurt School, Marcuse combined Marxism, psychoanalysis, and critical theory to deliver a deep, uncomfortable analysis of modern society. And that's exactly why he's dangerous. His ideas directly attack the false sense of freedom that consumer capitalism sells us. In his most famous work, One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse paints a disturbing picture. We live in a society that produces individuals who can't think critically or independently anymore. The system creates an illusion of choice, products, lifestyles, entertainment. But in reality, everything is designed to generate conformity and passive acceptance. He forces us to ask, is your freedom of choice real, or just a carefully manufactured illusion? Marcuse argues that technological progress, far from liberating us, has been used as a powerful tool of social control. Industrial innovations and mass media shape our desires, create artificial needs, and numb any impulse to resist. According to him, even leisure and pop culture are designed to maintain the status quo. But perhaps Marcuse's most controversial idea comes from his essay, Repressive Tolerance. Here's the provocation that still sparks debate today. Tolerating ideas that promote oppression and inequality is, in reality, reinforcing domination. For Marcuse, a truly just society cannot treat all ideas as equally valid, especially those that fuel authoritarianism and exclusion. His philosophy had a huge impact on the social movements of the 1960s, especially among students, activists, and young people fighting against war, racism, and conservative politics. Marcuse became something of an icon of rebellion, often referred to as the philosopher of the revolution. He believed that real social change could only happen through a radical shift in collective consciousness, breaking free from imposed patterns of consumption and thought. Marcuse also emphasized the importance of utopian imagination. In an increasingly grey, pragmatic world, he defended our right to dream of a radically different society, one based on real freedom, creativity, and meeting true human needs. He's dangerous because he pulls us out of our daily anesthesia, forces us to see the invisible systems conditioning us, and challenges us to push for transformation that goes way beyond surface-level changes. And the blunt question Marcuse leaves us with is this: are you ready to abandon the comfort of alienation and start thinking in a truly critical and revolutionary way? Frantz Fanon's work is a scream against colonial oppression, structural racism, and cultural alienation. Fanon is dangerous because he doesn't just analyze violence, he justifies it as a legitimate response to centuries of domination. His ideas echo like a call to resistance for anyone living under systems of oppression. In his most famous book, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon describes, with brutal clarity, the psychological, social, and economic suffering of colonized people. He argues that colonial violence isn't just physical, it's also symbolic and psychological. The colonized internalize a sense of inferiority, begin to hate their own culture, their own skin color, and start desperately wanting to become like their oppressors. Fanon hits us with a hard question. How many times have you accepted oppression as normal, without even realizing it? His background in psychiatry gives his analysis a unique depth. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon explores the psychological impact of racism, showing how prejudice destroys identity and creates a person divided between being and appearing. He describes how colonized black individuals often put on a white mask, trying to fit into a standard that's rejected them from the start. But the most controversial and dangerous aspect of Fanon's philosophy is his defense of revolutionary violence. For Fanon, decolonization can't be peaceful, because colonialism never was. He sees violence as a necessary act of liberation, a way to reclaim lost dignity. This position earned him harsh criticism, but also inspired countless liberation movements across Africa, Latin America, and beyond. Beyond his critique of colonialism, Fanon also calls out the traps of post-colonialism. He warns against the tendency of local elites, after independence, to simply replace the colonizers while keeping the same oppressive structures in place. For Fanon, true liberation only happens with a deep transformation of social, economic, and cultural relationships. His philosophy is both a call to action and a push for critical reflection. He forces us to confront racism, inequality, and alienation through an uncomfortable but necessary lens. The danger of Fanon is clear. He refuses to accept conciliatory speeches that sugarcoat oppression. His voice demands real justice, even if the path to get there is painful. And the urgent question Fanon leaves us with is this: are you willing to face the conflict and accept the cost of true emancipation? In times of political and moral crisis, few philosophers remain as relevant as Hannah Arendt. Instead of theorizing from the comfort of an office, Arendt wrote about the horrors she personally witnessed. Fleeing Nazi persecution, living in exile, and closely observing the rise of totalitarianism, she turned her lived experience into a philosophical analysis that still unsettles us today. In her monumental work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt goes beyond simply condemning authoritarian regimes. She traces a complex genealogy of how totalitarianism is born, grows, and infiltrates social structures by exploiting loneliness, political apathy, and the loss of collective meaning. It's not just about tyrannical governments, but about a social environment where isolation and distrust between people become the norm. Her most disturbing insight comes from Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she analyzes the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key figures behind the logistics of the Holocaust. What Arendt discovered is shocking. Eichmann was not a bloodthirsty monster. He was an ordinary, bureaucratic, obedient man, incapable of thinking about the consequences of his actions. This gave rise to the concept that stunned the world: the banality of evil. Arendt's great challenge is to show us that evil isn't always born from wicked intentions. It can arise from a simple inability to reflect, from the habit of following orders without question, from a mechanical routine that turns human beings into cogs in a blind machine. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. How often, in our daily lives, do we act automatically, without considering the ethical consequences of our actions? Another central aspect of Arendt's philosophy is her defense of political action as a space of freedom and collective responsibility. In The Human Condition, she emphasizes that true politics only happens when people actively participate in public life, express opinions, debate, and take responsibility for their choices. For her, political alienation opens the door to manipulation and authoritarianism. Moreover, Arendt warns about the dangers of misinformation and ideological manipulation. When facts no longer matter and truth becomes a matter of opinion, the ground becomes fertile for authoritarian regimes. Her philosophy is an invitation, or rather, a demand, that each individual thinks for themselves, questions, and doesn't get swept away by the current of blind obedience. And the cutting question Arendt leaves us with is: are you really thinking, or just playing the role others expect from you? Few philosophers spark as much debate and controversy in political science as Leo Strauss. For some, he is one of the greatest thinkers in modern political philosophy. For others, a dangerous intellectual whose ideas fueled elitist and authoritarian currents. Strauss isn't a philosopher of easy answers. His real impact lies in the uncomfortable questions he forces us to ask about democracy, truth, and power. In his most influential works, like Persecution and The Art of Writing, Strauss puts forward a bold thesis. Throughout history, many philosophers wrote in a veiled way, using esoteric language to protect their most dangerous ideas from censors and the general public. What seems openly stated may actually hide deeper, subversive meanings. This makes reading Strauss not just an exercise in interpretation, but a challenge in decoding. His reading of classical philosophy, from Plato to Machiavelli, is marked by deep skepticism about the transparency of texts. Strauss warns us, not all truths can or should be told to everyone. This raises a delicate philosophical and ethical question. Who decides what should be revealed and what must remain secret? In political philosophy, Strauss delivers a strong critique of modern relativism. For him, abandoning universal truths, blindly defending tolerance, and diluting objective values are signs of a deep moral crisis in the West. His work, Natural Right and History, defends the existence of an objective moral order that should guide political life. This position, while reviving the classics, also leaves room for authoritarian interpretations. The danger of Strauss lies precisely here. His defense of a philosophical elite capable of grasping the hidden truth was later linked to neoconservative movements and political manipulation strategies. Many accuse him of inspiring the idea that society can, or even should, be ruled by an enlightened minority, while the majority remains under a kind of controlled ignorance. On the other hand, Strauss also offers an important contribution: the need to revive serious debate about the foundations of politics, justice, and morality without falling into cynicism or ideological superficiality. His philosophy forces us to reflect on something essential and uncomfortable. Can any democratic society truly handle the truth, or are some truths just too dangerous to be openly told? And the question Strauss leaves us with is direct and provocative. Do you prefer to live in a world of pleasant truths? Or are you ready to face the hard truths, even if they unsettle you? Talking about Gilles Deleuze means diving into a philosophical universe that refuses to be linear, fixed, or predictable. Deleuze is dangerous precisely because he breaks with all traditional forms of thought. He challenges the logic of either-or and invites us to think in terms of multiplicity, flow, and constant transformation. Together with Félix Guattari, Deleuze wrote fundamental works like 1,000 Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus, which make up the philosophical project known as Capitalism and Schizophrenia. In these texts, they directly attack the structures that organize and control our desires, thoughts, and behaviors. Psychoanalysis, traditional politics, the capitalist system, all are put under suspicion. One of Deleuze's most provocative concepts is the rhizome. While most philosophers think of knowledge and reality like trees with clear roots and trunks, a center from which everything grows, Deleuze proposes the rhizome, a system without hierarchy, where everything connects unpredictably and non-linearly. This view breaks down the idea that thought needs to be organized sequentially and logically. Deleuze is also dangerous for his treatment of desire. Instead of seeing desire as a lack or something missing that needs to be filled, as Freud and Lacan do, he sees it as a productive, creative force. Desire, for Deleuze, isn't something we lack. It's what drives us, builds realities, and generates new forms of existence. This vision overturns the traditional way of understanding subjectivity. His critique of capitalism is just as radical. Alongside Guattari, Deleuze analyzes how the capitalist system captures our desires, shapes our identities, and turns us into cogs in the machine of production and consumption. They ask, is what you desire really yours, or is it the result of a system teaching you what to desire? In Deleuze's philosophy, everything is flow, everything is becoming. There's no fixed I, no unchanging identity. We are multiples, constantly transforming. This idea is liberating, but also deeply unsettling. Deleuze is dangerous because he takes away our ground. He forces us to think outside pre-established categories and to question the forms of power that organize us, even within our own minds. And the question he leaves us with is provocative and urgent. Are you ready to let go of certainties and open yourself to a way of thinking that is by nature uncontrollable, unpredictable, and always in motion? Walter Benjamin is the kind of philosopher who crosses time as a haunting presence. His writing is fragmented, poetic, and often enigmatic. But behind his metaphorical language lies a brutal and deep analysis of culture, history, and modernity. Benjamin is dangerous because he forces us to look at the ruins of civilization with eyes that are both critical and sensitive. In his most famous work, The Work of Art, in the age of its technological reproducibility, Benjamin reflects on a question that still echoes today. How does technology change the way we consume culture? He points out that with mass reproduction, a work of art loses its aura, that unique presence tied to the original time and place of its creation. This means that while art becomes more accessible, it also becomes more trivialized. How often do we consume images, music, and cultural content without even thinking about their origin or meaning? But Benjamin's danger goes beyond just criticizing mass culture. In his writings on history, like Theses on the Philosophy of History, he breaks with the idea that progress is a steady, continuous line of improvements. For him, history is a field of ruins, interruptions, and violence. He describes the angel of history, inspired by a painting by Paul Klee, as a figure looking back at destruction while being pushed forward into the future by a storm called progress. This vision forces us to reflect. Is what we call development really just piling up the wreckage of oppressed peoples and forgotten memories? Benjamin was also a deeply political thinker. His involvement with Marxism and his critique of fascism show that his philosophy was not distant contemplation. He saw culture and history as battlegrounds for ideological struggle. His concern was clear. How do we prevent the past of victims from being erased or manipulated? His language, often poetic, hides philosophical traps. Benjamin invites us to read the world like a text full of layers, hidden meanings, and interrupted significances. He challenges us to see the signs of power, even in the most ordinary details of daily life. Walter Benjamin's danger is this. He tears down the comfortable narrative of linear progress, exposes the mechanisms of cultural domination, and calls us to a state of constant alertness. And the question he leaves us with is direct and unsettling. Are you truly paying attention to the small cracks in history? Or are you just being carried along by a current of progress that might not be as innocent as it seems? Talking about Vladimir Lenin means diving into the explosive meeting of philosophy and radical political action. Lenin wasn't just a theorist, he was the architect of a revolution that changed the course of world history. And that's exactly why he's considered dangerous. His ideas didn't just stay on paper, they toppled an empire and sparked one of the most impactful and controversial regimes of the 20th century. Lenin is mainly known for his practical and strategic interpretation of Marxism. In works like What is to be Done and State and Revolution, he broke with the idea that revolution would arise spontaneously from capitalism's contradictions. For him, social change would only happen through organized, disciplined action, led by a vanguard revolutionary party. This idea is dangerous because it concentrates power in the hands of a political elite, justified by the need for conscious leadership over the masses. Lenin believed ordinary people alone wouldn't develop revolutionary consciousness. It was the party's role to guide, organize, and if necessary, impose the conditions for change. His concept of the state was also radical. Lenin saw the state as a tool of class domination. There was no neutrality. Every state, according to him, is always an instrument of the ruling class. That's why the proletarian revolution shouldn't just seize the bourgeois state, but destroy it and replace it with the dictatorship of the proletariat, a necessary transition toward a classless society. Lenin's danger is not just theoretical. His ideas inspired revolutions worldwide, armed movements, and regimes that, in the name of class struggle, imposed authoritarian practices, censorship, and political persecution. At the same time, many see Lenin as a symbol of resistance against imperialism, colonialism, and capitalist exploitation. His strategic insight, understanding of international relations, and reading of historical movements made him a leader who skillfully combined theory and practice. Lenin wasn't a philosopher secluded in an office. He wrote to intervene, transform, and mobilize. This political urgency shines through every line of his work. The challenge Lenin leaves us with is clear. Are you willing to just criticize the system? Or are you ready to act, organize, and transform, even if it means radical breaks? Lenin's thought remains a hot topic. For some, a symbol of emancipation. For others, the start of oppressive regimes. One thing is certain: ignoring him is impossible. Talking about Mao Zedong means entering a space where philosophy and political power explosively intertwine. Leader of the Chinese Revolution and founder of the People's Republic of China, Mao was not just a military strategist or head of state. Above all, he was a thinker who transformed Marxism into a weapon adapted to the concrete realities of 20th century China. And that's exactly why Mao is considered dangerous. His ideas didn't stay on paper. They mobilized millions, reshaped one of the world's largest nations, and left deep marks. Positive for some, tragic for others. In his best-known work, The Little Red Book, a collection of quotes and political thoughts, Mao systematizes his ideas in a direct and accessible way, creating a true handbook for revolutionary action. One of Mao's core ideas is that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. This phrase sums up his view that social transformation, especially in a largely agrarian country like China, could only be achieved through armed struggle. Mao also developed the concept of permanent revolution at the base, encouraging mass movements to challenge not only external enemies, but also the internal structures of the party and government. This was evident during the Cultural Revolution, one of the most controversial periods of his leadership. Young people were urged to criticize authorities, teachers, and even family members in the name of ideological purification. The goal was to destroy old traditions, customs, and ideas, but the result was a cycle of violence, persecution, and cultural destruction. Another key aspect of Mao's thought was his emphasis on prolonged popular war. He believed that the peasantry, not just the urban working class, should be the engine of the revolution. This strategic adaptation was crucial to the success of the Chinese Revolution. The philosophical danger of Mao lies exactly in his total fusion of theory and practice. In his hands, concepts like dialectical materialism and class struggle ceased to be just social analyses and instead guided state policies that affected millions of lives. Mao also believed the revolutionary process never ends. The class enemy, in his view, is always present, demanding constant vigilance and continuous mobilization. The big question Mao leaves us with is as unsettling as it is necessary. To what extent does social transformation justify breaking existing structures, even if the cost is the suffering of millions? Fyodor Dostoiévski may be known as a novelist, but his work is a true mine of existential, ethical, and psychological philosophy. Dostoiévski's danger isn't just in the ideas he presents, but in how he forces the reader to dive into the darkest corners of the human soul. Reading Dostoiévski means facing moral dilemmas that don't allow easy answers. In novels like Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, and Notes from Underground, Dostoiévski builds characters that embody the deepest existential conflicts. Raskolnikov, for example, the protagonist of Crime and Punishment, is a young man trying to justify the murder of an old pawnbroker based on a utilitarian logic, killing a worthless person to do good for many. But throughout the story, Dostoiévski dismantles this reasoning and forces us to confront the weight of guilt, remorse, and redemption. One of the most dangerous ideas in Dostoiévski's work is the notion that if God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. This phrase, from the Brothers Karamazov, sums up an ethical dilemma that remains relevant. What grounds morality if there's no divine order or universal law? What stops us from acting selfishly, cruelly, or destructively? Dostoiévski also dives deep into the psychology of doubt, faith, and despair. In Notes from Underground, he creates a narrator who is deeply cynical and resentful, criticizing both rationalism and idealism. This character is a mirror of modern existential anguish, someone who knows his contradictions but refuses to seek a cure. Another central theme in Dostoiévski's work is his reflection on suffering. For him, pain is paradoxically a path to spiritual transformation. When faced with courage and clarity, suffering can lead to self-knowledge, repentance, and even redemption. Dostoiévski's danger lies precisely here. He forces the reader to look into the inner abyss. His stories aren't just narratives, they're invitations to question human nature itself, freedom, responsibility, and guilt. He leaves us with a question that echoes through the centuries and keeps hammering at the conscience of anyone who encounters his work. How far are you willing to go in the name of your freedom? And are you ready to face the moral consequences of your choices? John Stuart Mill may not have taken up arms or led revolutions, but his ideas carry a subversive power as strong as any political uprising. A 19th century philosopher, economist, and social activist, Mill is dangerous because he put individual freedom at the center of his philosophy, challenging all forms of authoritarianism, political, moral, or cultural. In his most famous work, On Liberty, Mill vigorously defends each person's right to live as they wish, as long as their actions don't directly harm others. This principle, known as the harm principle, is a cornerstone of modern liberal thought. But beneath its apparent simplicity lies a deep philosophical challenge. To what extent does society have the right to limit individual behavior? Mill goes even further. He doesn't just defend freedom of action, but also freedom of thought and expression. To him, silencing an opinion, no matter how absurd or offensive it seems, is a crime against humanity. By shutting down a voice, society loses the chance to correct its own mistakes or strengthen its beliefs by facing opposing ideas. His uncompromising defense of free speech forces us to reflect on very current issues. In times of hidden censorship, social media cancel culture, and ideological polarization, Mill asks us, are we truly ready to listen to opinions we disagree with? Besides individual freedom, Mill was one of the first philosophers to seriously defend gender equality. In The Subjection of Women, he argues that female subordination has no natural or moral basis. It's the result of centuries of institutionalized oppression. For his time, this was a profoundly radical and dangerous position. In economics, Mill sought a delicate balance between defending free enterprise and recognizing the need for social intervention to correct extreme inequalities. He didn't accept unchecked capitalism as natural or inevitable. On the contrary, he warned about the dangers of wealth concentration and the exploitation of the working class. John Stuart Mill is dangerous precisely because of his insistence on freedom as a non-negotiable value. His philosophy pushes us out of our comfort zones, challenges our prejudices, and demands that we defend the right to think differently. And the question he leaves us with is as relevant as it is urgent. Are you truly willing to fight for the freedom of others, even those you most disagree with? Max Weber isn't the kind of thinker who offers easy answers. On the contrary, his philosophy is an uncomfortable invitation to look at the invisible structures that shape our social, economic, and political lives. And that's exactly why Weber is dangerous. He breaks down illusions about progress, rationality, and even the meaning of modern work. In his most famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber makes a bold connection between religion and economics. He shows how certain Protestant doctrines, especially Calvinism, helped create the work ethic centered on hard work, discipline, and wealth accumulation. For Weber, modern capitalism wasn't born just from technological advances or economic changes, but from a deep shift in how people began to see work and material success as signs of moral virtue. This analysis is dangerous because it challenges the idea that capitalism is simply a natural or inevitable system. Weber forces us to recognize that even our most personal beliefs about effort, merit, and success are socially constructed. Another key concept in his philosophy is rationalization. Weber describes how modernity brought increasing bureaucratization to every aspect of life. Everything becomes regulated by rules, procedures, and efficiency calculations. At first, this might seem positive. But Weber warns that we're entering an iron cage, where individual freedom is sacrificed for order and control. His analysis of bureaucracy is still a timely warning. Weber shows how modern institutions tend to create structures so rigid that humans become just another faceless cog in a machine. How many times have you felt like a number, a statistic, a lost form in a system that seems to work more for itself than for people? In politics, Weber is equally sharp. In his famous essay Politics as a Vocation, he discusses the ethical dilemma faced by those in power. For him, a true politician must balance two opposing ethics: the ethic of conviction and the ethic of responsibility. Good intentions aren't enough. One must consider the real consequences of every decision. Max Weber's danger lies in forcing us to see how much we are shaped by historical and cultural structures that often operate without us even noticing. And the question Weber leaves us with is clear and uncomfortable. Do you have the courage to take ethical responsibility for the consequences of your choices, even when they go against your personal beliefs? Noam Chomsky is one of the most controversial and influential intellectuals of our time. A linguist, philosopher, and political activist, Chomsky is dangerous not only because of the depth of his thinking, but also for the clarity with which he exposes the hidden mechanisms of power and social manipulation. His combination of sharp analysis and direct social critique makes him a threat to those who prefer to keep the masses in ignorance. In linguistics, Chomsky revolutionized the study of language with his theory of universal grammar, introduced in syntactic structures. For him, all humans are born with an innate ability to learn language. This theory not only transformed linguistic studies, but also raised deep philosophical questions about the nature of the human mind, knowledge, and learning. But Chomsky's real social impact comes from his political activism. In books like Manufacturing Consent, co-written with Edward S. Herman, he exposes how mass media are used as propaganda tools to shape public opinion in favor of economic and political elites. According to him, mass journalism doesn't inform, it manufactures consent. This analysis is dangerous because it forces ordinary citizens to view the news they consume every day with suspicion. Chomsky reveals how governments, big corporations, and intelligence agencies control information flow, manipulate narratives, and turn lies into unquestioned truths. He challenges us. How many of your beliefs are really the result of critical thinking, and how many have been implanted by a system that needs you passive and obedient? His critique of American imperialism is also sharp. In numerous works, Chomsky exposes the US's involvement in coups, wars, and human rights abuses worldwide, all justified under the banner of defending democracy. He dismantles the myth of neutrality and shows that behind humanitarian rhetoric often lie unspoken geopolitical and economic interests. Another reason Chomsky is dangerous is his ability to engage a wide audience, translating complex topics into accessible language without losing depth. He turns critical theory into political action, encouraging public debate and social mobilization. The challenge Chomsky leaves us with is clear. Are you willing to question everything you hear, read, and consume? Or will you keep passively accepting the official versions of reality? Talking about Carl Schmitt means entering one of the darkest and most controversial areas of 20th century political philosophy. A German jurist and thinker, Schmitt is considered dangerous because his ideas go straight to the core of politics. Whoever decides on the exception holds real power. His theories were used to justify authoritarian regimes and continue to influence both the far right and critics from various ideological backgrounds today. In his most famous work, Political Theology, Schmitt makes the famous statement, "The sovereign is he who decides on the exception." This means true political power isn't just about managing normal situations, but about controlling when rules can be suspended. This concept reveals the dark side of modern politics. In times of crisis, laws can be set aside, and sovereign decisions become absolute. Schmitt is dangerous because he makes us realize that behind the democratic facade, there's always the possibility of suspending legal order in the name of security, stability, or other emergency justifications. History has shown how these ideas were used by authoritarian regimes to legitimize coups and political persecution. Another key concept from Schmitt is the distinction between friend and enemy, developed in the concept of the political. For him, the essence of politics is conflict, identifying the enemy. There is no politics without conflict. This view is unsettling because it breaks with the idea of universal, peaceful consensus. Schmitt reminds us that every political order is built on exclusions, divisions, and decisions about who belongs and who must be opposed. Moreover, Schmitt challenges classical liberalism, accusing it of being unable to deal with the true essence of politics, which is marked by decision, conflict, and exception. His critique of parliamentarism, neutrality, and the search for consensus made him an uncomfortable reference both for authoritarian theorists and critics of liberal democracy. The danger of Carl Schmitt lies precisely in his clear exposure of the raw and realistic side of politics. He doesn't let us hide the violent and decisive face of power behind speeches of harmony and rationality. And the question he leaves us with is direct and unsettling. In a crisis, would you be ready to recognize who really holds power and how that power can be used against you? Alexander Dugin is one of the most controversial and dangerous thinkers in contemporary geopolitics. A Russian philosopher, sociologist, and strategist, Dugin openly reveals his intellectual ambition to offer the world a radical alternative to Western liberalism, globalism, and modern democratic values. His philosophy is a dense mix of extreme nationalism, mysticism, geopolitics, and fierce cultural critique. In his most influential work, Foundations of Geopolitics, Dugin presents an expansionist vision for Russia. He proposes creating a large Eurasian bloc led by Moscow that directly opposes the United States and NATO. For him, geopolitics is an existential struggle between two forces: the land power, represented by Russia, and the sea power, the West, led by the US and its allies. This logic of permanent conflict puts the world in a kind of constant ideological war. Dugin's danger isn't just theoretical. His book has been adopted by Russian military institutions, and his ideas have influenced Kremlin sectors, especially regarding territorial expansion and confrontation with the West. Many analysts point to him as one of the ideological inspirations behind Russia's intervention in Crimea in 2014 and the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But Dugin's thought goes beyond traditional geopolitics. In his fourth political theory, he rejects the three major 20th century systems: liberalism, communism, and fascism. Instead, he proposes a new order based on the ethnic, cultural, and spiritual identity of peoples, especially Russian civilization. His discourse is full of anti-globalism, anti-individualism, and a radical defense of tradition and nationalism. Dugin also flirts with mysticism and esotericism. He draws from philosophers like Heidegger and traditionalist authors like René Descartes and Julius Evola. This mix of obscure philosophy with practical politics makes his worldview even more unpredictable and dangerous. His rhetoric is one of absolute confrontation. For Dugin, there is no room for consensus or dialogue with the West. He defends conflict as the historical engine and war as a legitimate tool of geopolitical transformation. Alexander Dugin's danger is clear. He turns radical ideas into concrete political projects capable of influencing state decisions and fueling international conflicts. And the question he leaves us with is as urgent as it is disturbing. Are you ready to recognize when philosophy becomes a tool of war and how it can be used to justify the unacceptable? Julius Evola is undoubtedly one of the most dangerous and controversial philosophers of the 20th century. His work is a direct call to break away from modern, democratic, and egalitarian values. Evola doesn't hide his goal. He advocates a return to a traditional, hierarchical, and spiritual order that rejects materialism, liberalism, and everything Western modernity stands for. In books like Revolt Against the Modern World, Evola draws a clear line between what he calls tradition, with a capital T, and modern decay. For him, today's world is the result of a long process of spiritual decline. Secularism, rationalism, and equal rights are seen as symptoms of an irreversible downfall. Evola doesn't propose reforms. He calls for a true metaphysical uprising against the spirit of the age. His thought draws on sources ranging from Hindu and Buddhist esotericism to Western Hermetic philosophy. Evola is not an ordinary traditionalist. His vision is marked by extreme spiritual elitism. To him, only a few are truly superior men, capable of living according to the heroic and transcendental principles of tradition. This philosophy made him a reference figure for various far-right, neo-fascist, and identitarian movements over the decades. During Mussolini's regime, Evola had ideological ties to fascism, but he criticized both Italian fascism and German Nazism as, in his view, still too modern and not radical enough in breaking with democratic and bourgeois values. In Doctrine of Awakening, Evola tries to reinterpret early Buddhism as a philosophy of self-overcoming, distancing it from humanist or pacifist readings. His aim is always to exalt the figure of the differentiated man, someone who transcends the material world and is indifferent to public opinion and common morality. The danger of Evola lies in the aesthetic and intellectual appeal of his work. His sophisticated style, combined with a discourse of inner strength and spiritual superiority, means his ideas are still used today by groups seeking to justify authoritarianism, racism, and political violence. He offers a worldview where suffering is glorified, compassion is seen as weakness, and hierarchy is the natural order of things. The question Julius Evola leaves us with is unsettling and, unfortunately, still very relevant. Can you recognize when a philosophy of personal overcoming and spiritual tradition dangerously flirts with authoritarianism and dehumanization? Georg Lukács is one of the most influential and, at the same time, most feared Marxist philosophers of the 20th century. His work goes beyond economic analysis or superficial social critique. Lukács was a thinker who dove deep into the structures of human consciousness and society. The danger of his ideas lies exactly there. He doesn't just criticize capitalism, he breaks down the way we think, feel, and relate to the world under its influence. In his most famous work, History and Class Consciousness, Lukács introduces the concept of reification. According to him, under capitalism, everything, including human beings, turns into commodities. Social relationships stop being seen as living connections between people and instead become things, objects, tools for exchange. This transformation creates an alienated consciousness, unable to perceive the real dynamics of exploitation. Lukács asks us an uncomfortable question. Is what you consider natural in your daily life, your work routine, your consumption habits, actually a product of a system that turns you into an object? But Lukács' danger goes beyond economic critique. He was one of the first Marxists to highlight the importance of culture and ideology as key tools in reproducing the capitalist system. For him, the class struggle isn't only fought in factories or on the streets, but also in universities, newspapers, novels, and works of art. His reading of literature, for example, changed the way literary criticism understands the relationship between art and society. Lukács saw art as a battlefield of ideology, where the values of the ruling class are naturalized and perpetuated. Politically, Lukács had a path full of conflicts and contradictions. He actively participated in the Hungarian Revolution of 1919, serving as People's Commissar for Culture. Later, he faced criticism from both the right and dogmatic sectors within the communist movement itself. The danger of Lukács lies in his ability to show that alienation is not just a matter of individual consciousness, but a structural phenomenon rooted in the most everyday forms of life. He invites, or rather forces, us to see that overcoming alienation is only possible through a radical transformation of social relations. And the question Lukács leaves us with is direct and unsettling. Are you willing to look beyond appearances, and question the system that shapes you down to the smallest details of your existence. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon was one of the most controversial and challenging thinkers of the 19th century. Known as the father of anarchism, he not only questioned private property, but also the foundations of political authority, economics, and bourgeois morality. The danger of Proudhon lies in his ability to shake the structures that support power, capital, and the state. In his most famous work, What is Property?, Proudhon made a statement that became the symbol of his philosophy. Property is theft. By this, he wasn't denying the right to personal possessions like clothes or tools. His target was the ownership of the means of production, land, and capital, which, he argued, created exploitation and inequality. His analysis is straightforward and uncomfortable. The concentration of property lets some people live off the labor of others, building a society based on economic domination. Proudhon challenges us. Is what you call property rights really just the right to exploit others? But Proudhon didn't stop at criticism. He also proposed alternatives. He supported a social system based on free associations of workers, with self-management and mutual cooperation, without the need for a centralized state. This idea of a society without bosses, rulers, or fixed government was a key step in the development of modern anarchism. Another important concept in his work is mutualism. Proudhon dreamed of an economic system where exchanges would be fair and balanced, managed by popular banks and cooperatives, avoiding exploitation through high interest and excessive profits. His criticism of the state is also fierce. To him, all forms of government tend to turn into tools of oppression. Even democracies, if based on centralized power, end up reproducing tyranny over the individual. Proudhon's danger is in his ability to logically and ethically dismantle the pillars of private property and state authority. He forces us to rethink what social justice, economic freedom, and political organization really mean. His philosophy is an invitation, or perhaps a call, for autonomy and collective responsibility. And the question he leaves us with is as provocative as it is necessary. Are you ready to imagine and fight for a society without bosses or rulers, just free people cooperating with each other? Mikhail Bakunin is the living symbol of 19th century philosophical and political rebellion. An anarchist, revolutionary, and fierce critic of any form of centralized authority, Bakunin is dangerous because his philosophy goes beyond theory. It's a direct call to action and the destruction of established power structures. While Karl Marx believed the state could be used as a tool to transition to communism, Bakunin was relentless in his critique. For him, the state, no matter its form, is always a mechanism of oppression. It doesn't matter if it's bourgeois, proletarian, or socialist. The state is, by definition, a structure that concentrates power and suppresses individual and collective freedom. In works like God and the State, Bakunin makes a radical connection between religion and political power. He argues that both the idea of God and the idea of the state serve the same purpose: to submit the individual to a higher authority. His most famous phrase captures this spirit. If God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. This is not just a theological denial, but a philosophical rejection of any transcendent power that justifies submission. Bakunin's thought is also marked by unwavering optimism in people's ability to self-organize. He believed in a society based on self-management, federalism, and solidarity among workers, without the need for a central government. For him, freedom could only flourish when individuals took control of their own lives collectively and cooperatively. But Bakunin was no pacifist. His philosophy accepted and even defended revolutionary violence as a legitimate means to overthrow power structures. He saw revolution not as a bureaucratic or legislative event, but as a spontaneous popular uprising. This direct call to action made his ideas even more dangerous in the eyes of the authorities at the time. The historical conflict between Bakunin and Marx within the First International is a major philosophical and political milestone. While Marx defended centralizing proletarian power, Bakunin accused Marxism of paving the way for a new form of dictatorship. Bakunin's danger lies in his total rejection of any form of centralized authority. He is the thinker who asks bluntly, "Are you truly ready to live without bosses, without governments, and without any form of domination, taking full responsibility for your own freedom?" Diogenes of Sinope is the perfect example of how philosophy can be a tool for social provocation. Considered one of the greatest figures of the Cynic school in ancient Greece, Diogenes didn't write books, start academies, or try to please the powerful. His life was his philosophy, and that's exactly why he's dangerous. Through his way of living, he attacked all the social, political, and moral conventions of his time. Diogenes lived in radical simplicity. He lived in a barrel, begged for what he needed, and walked the streets of Athens carrying a lit lantern in broad daylight saying, "I'm looking for an honest man." With this act, he directly criticized the hypocrisy of Athenian society, where appearances mattered more than real virtue. His philosophy was an invitation, or perhaps a challenge to self-sufficiency and detachment from material things. He believed true happiness could only be reached when a person freed themselves from the artificial needs created by culture and social customs. The Cynic ideal was to live according to nature, ignoring rules that lacked rational foundation. Diogenes is dangerous because he refused to accept any form of social convention as legitimate. He ridiculed politicians, mocked academic philosophers, and provoked the rich and powerful through his voluntary life of extreme poverty. His philosophy is a punch in the face to vanity, greed, and the endless pursuit of status. One of the most famous stories about him is his meeting with Alexander the Great. When the emperor asked if he could do anything for him, Diogenes replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." This bold and direct answer perfectly shows his attitude. No power, no matter how great, deserved his reverence. Diogenes also attacked moral hypocrisy. He wasn't shy about doing things that shocked society, all to show that many behaviors we consider civilized are just social masks. His legacy is an invitation to inner freedom, the courage to live by your own principles, and a constant critique of all forms of hypocrisy. The question Diogenes leaves us with is provocative and timeless. Do you have the courage to live authentically, disregarding what society says is important, even if that means being seen as crazy, an outcast, or inconvenient? Denis Diderot was one of the great intellectual agitators of the French Enlightenment. A philosopher, writer, and editor, he didn't just question the power structures of his time. He helped build a true cultural transformation machine, the Encyclopedia, a monumental project that aimed to gather all human knowledge in one place. And that's exactly why Diderot is dangerous. He wielded reason, science, and freedom of thought as weapons against religious obscurantism and political tyranny. While editing the Encyclopédie alongside d'Alembert, Diderot brought together hundreds of contributors to produce a compendium of knowledge that directly challenged the control the church and state had over information. Each entry was a small bomb against dogma and ignorance. The Encyclopedia wasn't just a reference book, it was a manifesto for intellectual freedom. Diderot believed knowledge should be accessible to everyone. He saw education as a tool for emancipation and fighting oppression. His goal was clear: to enlighten minds and free them from the chains of superstition, intolerance, and political servitude. But Diderot's danger wasn't only in the philosophical content of his works, it was also in the way he thought. He was among the first to tackle topics like philosophical atheism, moral relativism, and materialism. In texts like Letter on the Blind, he suggested that reality is mediated by the senses, and knowledge is always the result of experience. This materialist view was a direct attack on the religious metaphysics of his time. His intellectual boldness also showed in his defense of freedom of speech and criticism of institutions. Diderot didn't hold back attacks on the hypocrisy of the church and the authoritarianism of the monarchy. His writing was often censored, and he was even imprisoned for his opinions. Additionally, Diderot broke with traditional morality in his reflections on sexuality, pleasure, and personal freedom. In works like Jacques the Fatalist, he subverts narrative conventions and challenges readers to think about free will and determinism. The danger of Diderot lies here. He didn't just want to reform society, he wanted to awaken consciences and pull people out of intellectual passivity. And the question he leaves us with is as timely as it is provocative. Are you ready to question everything you've been taught to accept as truth and take the risk of thinking for yourself? Heraclitus of Ephesus, known as the philosopher of becoming, is one of the most enigmatic and provocative thinkers of ancient Greek philosophy. His ideas are dangerous precisely because they shake any attempt to find security in fixed, definitive truths. Heraclitus invites us to abandon the illusion of stability and see the world as a constant, unpredictable, and transformative flow. His most famous phrase is direct and unsettling. No man ever steps in the same river twice. The idea is clear. Everything is always changing. Just as the waters of a river are constantly renewed, we too change every moment. There is nothing absolute or permanent in the sensory world. Everything flows. Everything transforms. This view is dangerous because it challenges the human desire for control, safety, and permanence. Heraclitus forces us to accept impermanence as the only constant. He asks us, almost poetically, are you ready to accept that the world is made of change and that clinging to certainty is just a comforting illusion? Beyond his reflection on becoming, Heraclitus introduces an equally powerful and disturbing concept: conflict as the driving force of reality. According to him, war, understood symbolically, is the organizing principle of the cosmos. Harmony isn't the absence of conflict, but the balanced tension between opposites. Life and death, cold and heat, waking and sleeping, all are defined by opposition. This philosophy is uncomfortable because it makes us realize that the stability we seek is only a temporary state between forces constantly at odds. For Heraclitus, the universe is a dance of contradictions, and true wisdom lies in recognizing and accepting this dynamic. Another central concept is the logos, the universal reason governing all things. Though often invisible and hard to grasp, the logos is the rational structure behind change. Heraclitus believes that by understanding the logos, humans can reach a deep understanding of reality, even amid apparent chaos. Heraclitus is dangerous because he pulls us out of our comfort zones. His philosophy allows no dogmatism, accepts no eternal truths. It forces us to live in motion, to constantly rethink our beliefs, and to embrace uncertainty. And the question he leaves us with is simple, but devastating. Do you have the courage to live in a world where everything is always changing, including yourself? Protagoras of Abdera is one of the most challenging philosophers of ancient Greece. A central figure of the Sophist movement, he is dangerous because he attacked one of the most cherished pillars of Western philosophy, the idea of an absolute and universal truth. Protagoras opened the door to a relativistic view of reality that still sparks heated debates among philosophers, scientists, and politicians today. His most famous phrase, which sums up his thinking, is direct and unsettling. Man is the measure of all things. This means there is no fixed truth that applies to everyone in every situation. Each person, with their experiences, perceptions, and circumstances, builds their own reality. In other words, what's true for one person may be false for another, and neither is absolutely wrong. This relativism is deeply dangerous because it undermines the idea of universal morality, objective justice, and definitive knowledge. Protagoras forces us to recognize that our worldview is always partial, shaped by our human limitations. He provocatively asks, are you ready to accept that what you consider true might be just one perspective among many? Beyond the question of truth, Protagoras was also one of the first to approach education as a tool for social transformation. As a sophist, he taught rhetoric and argumentation to young Athenians, preparing them for public life. His mission was clear: to teach the art of persuasion. It wasn't so much about what was true, but about what was most effective in convincing others. This approach drew sharp criticism, especially from philosophers like Socrates and Plato, who saw sophists as a threat to the sincere pursuit of truth. To them, Protagoras represented the risk of a society dominated by manipulative rhetoric, lacking ethical foundation. On the other hand, Protagoras can also be seen as a precursor of modern democracy. His relativism opens space for dialogue, recognizing diversity of opinions and the constant need to negotiate between different viewpoints. The danger of Protagoras lies precisely in his refusal to accept any form of dogmatic thinking. He invites us to question absolute truths and practice a critical, flexible attitude toward differences. And the question he leaves us with, still so relevant today, is this: are you ready to live in a world where there is no single truth, and where everything depends on the perspective of the observer? Émile Durkheim is one of those thinkers who, with cold and meticulous analysis, exposed uncomfortable truths about modern society. Considered one of the founders of sociology, Durkheim is dangerous because he revealed that much of what we think are individual, moral, or spiritual decisions are actually the product of invisible social pressures. His philosophy dismantles the myth of the individual's absolute autonomy. In his central work, Suicide, Durkheim did something unprecedented. He turned a deeply personal topic into an object of sociological study. He showed that suicide, often treated as an individual psychological problem, is strongly linked to social factors like integration, regulation, and social cohesion. In other words, society, with its rules, values, and institutions, influences even the most intimate decisions. His question is direct and uncomfortable. How many of your choices are truly your own, and how many are shaped by your social environment? Another fundamental concept in Durkheim's work is the social fact. He defined social facts as external forces that exert pressure on individuals, whether laws, customs, norms, or beliefs. These facts are so powerful, they shape our behavior without us even noticing. For him, even our feelings of right and wrong are social constructions. In the Rules of Sociological Method, Durkheim argued that society should be studied as an organism, with its own structures that operate objectively. He rejected purely individual explanations for social phenomena. To understand reality, we must look beyond the individual and analyze the collective mechanisms that sustain social life. His analysis of religion, found in the elementary forms of religious life, is equally provocative. Durkheim claimed that religion is a symbolic representation of society itself. Gods, rituals, and myths serve to strengthen social cohesion by creating bonds between individuals. For many, this view is a direct attack on traditional faith, as it reduces the sacred to a social creation. Durkheim's danger lies precisely in his ability to reveal that behind our decisions, values, and even emotions, there are invisible structural forces. He shatters the illusion of complete control over our lives and makes us see how much we are products of the environment in which we live. The big question Durkheim leaves us with is direct and unsettling. Are you ready to accept that your deepest beliefs may not come from your individuality, but from the society that has shaped you all along? Joseph de Maistre is one of the most conservative and controversial political thinkers in the history of philosophy. His worldview is a direct attack on Enlightenment ideas of liberty, equality, and reason. The danger of Maistre lies exactly here. He openly defends hierarchy, absolute authority, and repression as necessary foundations for social order. In works like Considerations on France and the Knights of St. Petersburg, Maistre argues that the French Revolution was a disaster, a divine punishment against a people who dared to challenge traditional structures. For him, political and social order must be rooted in institutions like the monarchy, the church, and patriarchal power. The chaos and violence of the revolution were, to Maistre, clear proof that trying to build a society based solely on human reason would inevitably lead to destruction. His view on power is equally radical. Maistre believed that all government is, ultimately, theocratic. This means that all legitimate authority, even political authority, originates from the divine. God's will, he argued, is expressed through kings and rulers. Questioning the sovereign, then, is an act against the very cosmic order. Another reason Maistre is dangerous is his justification of violence as a tool to maintain order. He saw the death penalty, war, and even torture as legitimate expressions of divine will and the need to contain human evil. In his writing about the executioner, he claimed that this agent of state violence is essential for the existence of civilization. His critique of Enlightenment rationalism is harsh. Maistre saw human reason as limited, fallible, and often arrogant. For him, man left to his own reason tends toward error, disorder, and sin. That's why he defended unconditional submission to tradition, religious authority, and social hierarchy. Maistre's philosophical danger lies not only in his theoretical ideas, but also in the fact that his thought inspired reactionary, absolutist, and authoritarian movements throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. He represents the voice that bluntly says, freedom is a dangerous illusion. Order exists only through authority, faith, and fear. And the unsettling question Joseph de Maistre leaves us with is, are you ready to recognize how the pursuit of security and stability can lead to accepting, or even desiring, the return of authoritarian and violent regimes? Thomas Paine was undoubtedly one of the boldest and most fiery voices of the Enlightenment. A writer, political philosopher, and revolutionary activist, Paine is dangerous because he turned abstract ideas of freedom and justice into powerful weapons against the oppressive systems of his time. His words didn't just stay in books, they helped spark real revolutions with blood, sweat, and upheaval. In his most famous work, Common Sense, published in 1776, Paine directly attacked the British monarchy and championed the independence of the 13 American colonies. The book sold thousands of copies and had a direct political impact on the course of the American Revolution. Paine spoke simply, clearly, and forcefully. He wanted ordinary people to understand that the king's authority was not natural, but an unjustifiable historical construction. Paine didn't stop there. In The Rights of Man, he expanded his critique, now targeting the French monarchy and supporting the French Revolution. For him, human rights were not grants given by rulers, but natural rights inherent to every human being. He believed governments should exist only with the consent of the governed, and true political legitimacy came from the will of the people. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of Thomas Paine was his courage to criticize organized religion. In The Age of Reason, Paine made a radical defense of reason and deism, attacking religious institutions for promoting irrational dogmas and perpetuating ignorance. He did not deny the existence of God, but vehemently rejected revealed religions and sacred texts as sources of moral authority. This stance cost him dearly. Once seen as a revolutionary hero, after his religious criticisms, he became a political and social outcast, even in the United States, the country he helped to found. The danger of Thomas Paine lies in his combination of clarity, courage, and radicalism. He wasn't afraid to confront kings, priests, aristocrats, or any authority that tried to limit human freedom. His philosophy is an invitation to direct action, civil disobedience, and constant challenge to any power not built on justice and the consent of the people. And the question Thomas Paine leaves us with is as urgent today as it was in his time. Are you willing to question all forms of authority and fight for freedom, even if it costs you your reputation, your comfort, and even your safety? Richard Rorty was one of the most subversive and unsettling philosophers of contemporary thought. His work is dangerous because it breaks down one of the biggest ambitions of the Western philosophical tradition, the search for universal, objective, and final truths. Rorty forces us to face an uncomfortable reality. Maybe truth is just a matter of temporary consensus, built by human communities. In works like Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, Rorty harshly criticizes what he calls representational epistemology, the idea that the human mind should mirror an external objective reality. For him, philosophy made a historical mistake by trying to be a kind of science of truth. Knowledge, according to Rorty, is not a faithful reflection of reality, but a cultural, historical, and linguistic product. This view becomes clearer in Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, where Rorty proposes a model of thought based on contingency. Nothing, neither language, nor moral beliefs, nor political institutions, has an ultimate foundation. Everything we believe results from social practices and historical circumstances. This idea is dangerous because it challenges concepts like universal justice, natural rights, or absolute moralities. At the same time, Rorty was not a cynical nihilist. On the contrary, he defended an ethics based on solidarity. For him, what keeps society together isn't holding on to unchanging truths, but the ability to create narratives that promote empathy, inclusion, and mutual respect. His proposal is to stop searching for metaphysical foundations for morality and instead build a fairer society through practical dialogue and democratic coexistence. Rorty's philosophical danger lies precisely in his refusal to accept ultimate foundations. His philosophy opens the door to relativism, which made him a target of criticism from both the conservative right and traditional Marxist left. Critics say Rorty flirts with the idea that all opinions are equally valid, which could weaken the fight for social justice. But Rorty responds, the absence of universal truths does not mean the absence of ethical commitment. He invites us to be liberal ironists, people who recognize the fragility of their own beliefs, but still fight for freedom and solidarity. The question Richard Rorty leaves us with is provocative and unavoidable. Can you live with the idea that everything you believe might be contingent and still keep fighting for a better world? Alasdair MacIntyre is one of the most critical philosophers of modern morality. His thinking is dangerous because it deeply questions the foundations of contemporary ethics, breaking down the idea that we can live morally based only on individual reason or abstract universal values. In his best-known work, After Virtue, MacIntyre delivers a relentless diagnosis. Western morality is in crisis. MacIntyre argues that after the Enlightenment, Western society tried to build a rational ethics without roots in historical traditions or community practices. The result? A fragmented moral landscape full of contradictory talks that lack real meaning. For him, modern ethical debates often sound like people using the same words, like justice or good. But in practice, they don't share any common ground. The danger of MacIntyre lies exactly here. He forces us to face the fact that much of today's morality might just be a collection of disconnected slogans with no solid philosophical base. His critique hits right at the heart of concepts like individual autonomy, moral pluralism, and even certain forms of ethical liberalism. But MacIntyre doesn't stop at criticism. He proposes a return to virtue ethics, inspired by the Aristotelian tradition. For him, building character, engaging in social practices, and being rooted in a historical community are essential for forming a meaningful moral life. This means ethics can't be reduced to individual decisions based on short-term rational calculations. In his view, it's within community practices, like education, local politics, religious life, and cultural traditions, that we develop virtues like courage, justice, and honesty. Without this social context, according to MacIntyre, the modern individual is lost, lacking a true moral compass. Another key idea is that we live in an age of emotivism, where moral judgments are based only on personal feelings and preferences, without any rational structure or narrative to give them meaning. The danger of MacIntyre is clear. His philosophy directly challenges extreme individualism, moral relativism, and cultural fragmentation that mark our contemporary world. He forces us to ask, what is the real purpose of moral life if it's not connected to a common good built collectively? And the question he leaves us with is as uncomfortable as it is necessary. Are you willing to abandon empty moral talk and rebuild your ethical life through concrete practices rooted in a real community? If you've made it this far, It means you're not afraid to face ideas that truly challenge you. These were 50 philosophers, 50 different ways to shake up certainties, question truths, and open new doors for reflection. This journey through some of the most dangerous minds in history wasn't just an intellectual trip. It was an invitation to transformation. Now, if this content made sense to you, please leave a like. It's really important to help this video reach more people who, like you, are searching for more than ready-made answers. Share it with that friend who loves a good philosophical challenge, or even someone who needs to start seeing the world differently. And of course, if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. Click the subscribe button and hit the bell so you don't miss any upcoming content. Here, philosophy is treated seriously, but never without the passion to question everything. Leave a comment. Which of these philosophers affected you the most? Which one pushed you out of your comfort zone? I really want to know what your most powerful takeaway was after this journey. And don't leave the channel. There's plenty more content waiting for you. More videos with debates, dilemmas, and new challenges are on their way. Thank you so much for being here, and see you in the next video.